Welcome to another episode of the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University. Procurement time, lead time, inventory management, freight costs, and supply chain management. These are terms encountered by businesses and business analysts on an everyday basis. The contemporary corporation Amazon takes great pride in its two-day delivery system and its network of warehouses across the US. And it would be impossible to explain the emergence of contemporary logistics and supply chains without the reduction in container costs in the last 5 decades. Yet, mainstream economics and theory provides very little discussion of these important topics in economics. In contrast, as we have seen in this series on Marx's Capital, the 3 volumes in particular, these topics are central to Marx's analysis of contemporary capitalism. This week, the Dialectic devotes a rather provocative episode to the following idea: Karl Marx as an analyst of real businesses. Karl Marx, the analyst of contemporary capitalism and supply chains. Karl Marx, an analyst whose work will be able to explain how Amazon became a trillion-dollar company. With me to make sense of all of this is a man who's devoted his entire life to teaching Marxism, popularizing his ideas, and interpreting and reinterpreting them in creative ways. Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, Richard Wolff. Hi, Rick. How are you?
Very good, Shahram.
Rick, I wanted to start off with a story, as always. I once went to Steve, and I was really enamored by the U.S. stock market. You know, that's a thing for us when we come from the third world. We're like the S&P 500. Wow, this is the route to getting rich in life. So I went to Steve, and I asked him, Steve, I really want to learn about the stock market and how real businesses work. Should I read Warren Buffett? Who should I read? And he very, very seriously turned around and said, the 3 volumes of Capital. Would you agree with that sentiment?
Yes, Steve and I talked about it many times. And I told him, as I'm happy to tell you now, that since I have basically lived most of my life in or around New York City, which is the economic center of U.S. capitalism, I have met in my lifetime quite a few folks on Wall Street who are analysts, who are investment advisors, and sometimes who run family offices, as they're called, for the super rich. And it turns out, when you get to know them, that many of them were active socialists and communists when they were young. Then they went through the McCarthyite reaction to World War II, when the United States and the Soviet Union were allied. They lost their jobs often where they were, but one of the places they could find work was Wall Street, which didn't care what they had done before, simply looked at them and said, if you can make us money, we will hire you. If you cannot, we won't. And they loved explaining to me how their learning of Marxism, usually at an earlier point in their lives, gave them the methods, the tools, the questions to ask that made them successful on Wall Street. So what Steve was saying has empirical support, if you can put it that way.
Wow. So, Rick, I wanted to begin with, obviously, we're discussing volume 2. And in particular, I wanted to encourage audiences to understand that Marx's volume 2 provides us with a very accurate description of what he terms the circuits of capital, but really is a metaphor for how the real business environment works. So he devotes an entire chapter to this idea that he's developing in volume 2, known as circulation time. Circulation time. And you explained to us in the last season, when we were discussing volume 1, that Marx's notion of time, production time, socially necessary labor time, time. Time keeps emerging as a very important concept in his analysis. So, what is this idea of circulation time that he's beginning to play with in volume two?
I think the best way to get into this is to understand that when Marx reached the conclusion after years of study that he wanted to begin with what we talked about and what contained in volume one, that he wanted to begin by showing that the core reality that made sense for him was to understand that surplus is something workers do that produces a product over and above what the workers consume, and that surplus is taken by people other than those workers and used by them to reproduce this system. And that on the basis of that insight, laid out in great detail in volume one, he would begin to show how you can connect everything else in the capitalist economy to that first core, and thereby understand how the different parts play their role in enabling surplus to be produced, to be reproduced over time, so that this system called capitalism has a history. And it allowed him then to show us, which is why it's a good idea for you to talk about Marx as an analyst for business. It allowed Marx to show exactly how the different parts of a capitalist system play their role, how they are all understandable around this core notion of the exploitation of labor by capital. And so in volume two, he begins, he could have begun in other places and in his workings on these notebooks, because volume two was prepared more by Engels, his buddy, than by Marx, based on notebooks after Marx had in fact died. So these notebooks are filled with saying, how does the production and distribution of surplus shape and get shaped by other things going on, which includes the business world? And here comes the issue of time. Time is a crucial part of every business. And the reason for that is simple, really very simple. Decisions have to be made now, at this moment in time, that depend on a future situation that you cannot know, something that's going to happen at a different time, and that the passage of time between the decision made now, for example, to invest or to enlarge your company if you already have one, such decisions have to be made now, even though the product that you will sell will not appear until a whole bunch of time and other activities have taken place. And that means for Marx, how do I connect the production and distribution of surplus that I laid out in volume one with, for example, this passage of time and its central position inside every business?
Wow. So, in other words, if we look at the circuit of capital that we've developed with you over the course of the last few episodes, each of those circuits is taking place in time. For example, M to means of production, the procurement side is going to take place in time. M to labor power, HR is going to take time. So, is this a coincidence? I've always wondered, and I mean, tell me if you agree with this. When we look at a contemporary business these days and their departments and how they've categorized themselves, they seem to correspond with each of those categories. M to MOP would be procurement, M to L would be the HR, for example, the P would be manufacturing. Is this a coincidence, or am I reading too much into it, or is this inbuilt into the theory?
No, it's built into the theory, and very, very intentionally. I mean, time has been crucial. Every capitalist's survival, let me put it as strongly as possible because Marx does this. The survival of a capitalist, when he or she competes with other capitalists, can and often does hang on the comparative management of the time involved in every capitalist enterprise. One, as Marx does this in volume 2, a capitalist who takes more time than another one, even if what they're producing is the same product, even if the technology they're using is the same technology, if one of them, for whatever reason, takes more time than another one, it will affect which of them survives competitively. So it is literally of the essence, no matter how you mean that word, to understand the role of time. And it is not at all an accident. What you're noticing is Marx's own inference. He knew very well about the time that it takes, because a capitalist has to find the right quality of inputs and the right quantity of inputs. He has to find where he can buy them. That takes time. He has to then take the time to move them from wherever they are to wherever he needs to put them into production. Then, in order to protect himself against market changes, he may need to store inputs for some time in an inventory. All of that Marx is very aware of, talks about in volume 2, so you can see his awareness. And then the same applies to the period of production, and then to the period of selling, that is, unloading the finished product into the hands of somebody who will pay you for it. All of those things take time, and as Marx shows in volume 2, they take money and they take hiring people. And this takes us back, if I can take a moment, to reminding people that Marx has this distinction between productive and unproductive laborers. He wants us to keep that distinction because it will allow him to disaggregate the category wage laborer, because some wage laborers are the exploited workers of volume 1 who produce the surplus. But other laborers who also get paid a wage by the same capitalist are engaged in the procurement of inputs, in the management of the time it takes, who are in charge of managing the inventory, who are then in charge of managing the sales program. Those are all people paid a wage, using their brains and muscles to do work, but they don't produce the surplus. They enable the surplus producers to be effective in the surplus they produce. But they are enablers, but Marx didn't use the word enabler. I do, because I live in a different idiom from him. His language, unproductive laborer, because he wanted to show by using that term that he had studied that word, unproductive laborer, in Smith, in Ricardo, and in other earlier economists. He was borrowing it, changing it, but borrowing it for his own work. So you can see he has a very rich understanding of all the issues he's now going to have to work on to link them back to the production of surplus and the exploitation of surplus producing workers.
Wow. So going back to this discussion, or this rather thorny subject of productive versus unproductive labor, because it's, for some reason, it always evokes a lot of emotions as well, for reasons that I have never been able to understand. But um, when we examine all of these circulation costs that Marx is looking at in this particular book, in volume two, would I be accurate? Would it be accurate to say that all the processes other than production time do not add new value to the existing capital, whereas circulation costs or circulation of capital refers to the process where it just changes its form? So there's no addition, there's a change of form, and that's the reason why the old man wants us to differentiate between these two. Is that accurate in your view?
Yes, that is basically the distinction. The productive worker is the one who produces the surplus, and the unproductive worker, the one who does all of the other things that have to be done. And let me drive it home. There is no interest in Marx in ranking the workers. The reason many people get uncomfortable is that they hear, which is understandable, one worker is productive, the other one is unproductive. That sure sounds like a ranking. I can understand, especially in English, but in general. But it's not that. It's a question of location. One of the people is located at the point of producing a surplus, and the other ones are located elsewhere. But Marx is spelling out the whole surplus, money to commodity, through production into a different commodity, and then that conversion of that second commodity back into money. Those are all necessary. There's no shortcut. There's no evading or avoiding any of that. You don't do the money into inputs, you don't get production. If you don't do production, you can't circulate and sell the final output. If you don't sell the final output, you don't recover the money with which you begin then to buy more inputs. So the whole of the circuit is how capitalism reproduces itself. Nothing would be further from Marx's argument than to rank one as more important. It is not a quantitative difference, it's a qualitative difference having to do with location of the work, of the labor, of the wage paid to the production of surplus. Since Marx's entry point, his way of understanding capitalism is to make us see through all the permutations and combinations the exploitation of the majority of workers that is the core of this system. That's his task. In order to get us to appreciate the horror of exploitation, he has to show how it is at work in all these other areas that at first sight don't look like it. Right? If you see a capitalist with money buying things, you could think in neoclassical economics terms. This is an exchange. The capitalist has money he doesn't need and want. The worker has, doesn't have the money that he needs and wants, and so they cut a deal. This is the world of exchange. Marx is interested in, but how? In its relationship to what it is that neoclassical economics has to pretend isn't going on. In neoclassical, it's simply a question of a perspective that looks at the relative balancing of the two sides of an exchange. Nothing happens there. It's qualitatively different, but it's an exchange of equals. Marx says, yes, it is, but it is tied into, its meaning comes from its relationship to the exploitation. Neoclassicals can't go there because they don't understand what exploitation is. They literally don't see it, and so they come up with a radically different way of understanding what's going on. Last point. To the feminists amongst us, In a very sad twist of fate, the notion of unproductive labor was used incorrectly, in my view, but it was used to rank workers, which is why I'm as strongly focused on criticizing that notion. It was used to rank workers. There were political movements who felt they needed to identify who was the key worker in a capitalist system. I think that's a logical mistake. I think that's a political mistake. For me, you can't do that because their differences are qualitative, not quantitative. I don't know where the revolution will come from. Could it be that it comes from the productive workers? They take the lead? Sure. I think that sometimes happens. Could it be that the unproductive workers do it? Sure. That sometimes happens. There's a whole host of ideological, cultural, historical factors that will determine which group of workers is the most militant, the most revolutionary, the earliest at the barricades. But it has nothing to do with Marx thinking that structurally we know in advance which group of workers it'll be because they are either productive or unproductive. That's not what Marx meant, and I defy you to find any place in his writing where he says any such a thing. In fact, I can show you, and Steve and I quoted it in our books, that the unproductive worker is as important to the reproduction of capitalism as the productive worker. Seems to me that kind of settles it.
Yeah. Just a little bit about this issue. Since so Steve used to argue that we cannot deduce from the activity itself, from the verb itself, whether it's unproductive or productive. The
That's right.
same product, the same service, the same activity could be productive or unproductive depending on where it's situated in the circuit of capital. For
Right.
example, you guys used to give us a test in which the security guard would be, or the security services would be, the service that we're examining. And Steve would ask us, can you deduce whether this security service, the guard who's, providing security services to the firm, is he productive or unproductive? Well, we would need more information to make that determination. So my question to you is the same question. Some people argue that just by looking at a particular activity, we can deduce whether it's productive or unproductive, even in the purely strict Marxian theoretical sense of the term. But you guys have been trying to teach your students that it depends on how that activity is situated in the circuit of capital. Could you help our audiences
Yeah.
understand?
Yeah, I could use the security, but since you mentioned it, I'll pick something else. Let's take record keeping. Many companies, capitalist enterprises, hire workers to keep records. I'm going to use as an example a company that makes software programs. So they have an employer, XYZ company, and they hire programmers, a bunch of them, and their job is to make software of some sort or another. And then the company sells that software. Those software producers, those people, are productive workers in that enterprise. They are hired, they produce more software than that which will be sold and with the money used to pay their wages. They do more than that, and the extra that the employer sells, the employer keeps as his profit, and so forth. But it is necessary in this firm to also employ other workers, record keepers. They make sure that they keep a record of each programmer when he or she comes to work in the morning, that they're on time, that they put in the requisite number of hours, if they're sick, that they use up their sick days, etc., etc. These workers are unproductive. They enable the productive programmers to do their work, but they themselves do not make what this enterprise produces and sells. So they are unproductive workers who enable the productive workers to do their job. And in that way, they're similar to the salesmen and women, if they are employed by such a company, or to the purchasing department of the company that buys the inputs and so on. But now let's suppose that an enterprising young capitalist watching all of this says, I am going to do something different. I am going to hire a group of record keepers, and I am going to hire them to produce record keeping as a commodity that I sell, just the way the first employer sold the software that the programmers produced. In that case, the record keepers are productive because they're producing a surplus for an employer. In other words, it's the relationships among people that Marx is interested in. Capitalism is a relationship whose core involves one person exploiting another. In my second example of the record keeper, the employer, the young new capitalist, is entering into a relationship in which the record keepers produce a surplus of record keeping for him. They don't do that in the first situation. So, to answer the question about any group of workers, no matter what they do, you cannot infer their relationships by looking at the work, the specific task that they're engaged in, their skill, their training, their movement of their arms and legs, their brain work, and so on. You have to ask about the relationship. And that requires you to ask the kinds of questions Marx asks. Is this worker doing production? If he or she or they are, all right, is there a surplus? If there is, who's getting it? Those are the questions you ask about the relationship among people at the workplace, and that will determine whether a wage earner is a member of the productive worker or of the unproductive worker category. And finally, this is an important matter. For example, if you are trying to organize workers into a political party or a labor union or any kind of organization, you want to be able to build a unity that is respectful of people's differences. Efforts to do this have come to grief if people were not sensitive to ethnic, gender, and other differences among the workers they're trying to unify. The same applies to the productive, unproductive. Those are different in important ways. Where you are located in the surplus producing core of capitalism will determine much of how you process the ideologies with which you are confronted, the political processes in which you are engaged, and so forth. So you will need attention to those differences, just the way you do to differences of gender, to differences of ethnicity, of race, if you believe in that category, and so on. And that's why it's very valuable for labor organizers and political organizers also to pay close attention to how Marx is helping us figure out how to differentiate and understand the differences between people who all have the label wage earner or wage worker or employee. You can use those categories, but you have to be aware that there are Marxist ways of using them, and then there are other ways, and that's been a struggle for a long time.
Wow. Rick, before I ask you about the question of turnover rate and turnover time, which is a concept he develops in volume 2 and 3, I wanted to ask you a question about the history of economic thought, if you like,
Yes.
particularly your relationship with Stephen Heimer, Paul Baran, Sweezy, etc. And in particular, because these guys were interested in corporate capital and they were trying to explain contemporary capitalism using the corporation as the starting point. I've always been curious and I've always wanted to ask you this question. Um, were they aware of the fact that, well, there's financial firms, there's retail firms, there's producing firms? Because these days, when we look at contemporary global supply chains, we we find that there's financial firms, holding firms, retail firms, manufacturing firms, all kinds of firms, and there seems to be an inequality within those firms as well. What am I saying? What I'm trying to say is that, well, if we look at the supply chain of textiles, for example, H&M sells things, Warren Buffett finances them. These two firms are really doing really well, whereas the firms that are actually producing the product in China or Bangladesh, etc., their operating margins are pathetic. So, in terms of monopoly capital and this school of thought that your teachers developed, basically, Olberon, Sweezy, and then later Stephen Heimer, how how were they using Volume Two in their discussions? Because I don't find that analysis, at least not the way you guys interacted with it in their text. So it's a history of economic thought question. That would be interesting for a lot of our friends.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I don't want to comment or speak to their understanding. From what I know, personally, my personal interactions with Sweezy, with Magdoff, and with Baran, they were close students of Marx's work. But having said that, every bit as much as Steve Resnick and myself. But having said that, I would remind people that Marx's work covers 3 volumes of Capital. It is an immensely rich, dense piece of work. I mean, it is rare in the density of its argumentation across all different approaches. That's why Marx, despite his revolutionary commitments, remains, if not in, then very close to that pantheon of the great Marxist thinkers that most economists at least pay lip service to, because it was so prodigious what he had done and what he had achieved, especially if you're familiar with his detailed criticism of all the economists that came before him in his theories of surplus value, another 3 volumes of work that was his work mostly. So when you have a sense of the enormity, which comes over you if you read it carefully, then you become aware, or you should, that the environment in which you live, the work you do, the students, if you're an academic, that you have, the material you're reading, the news that's going on, the wars around you. I'm obviously reflecting my moment right now. They play a role in which part of this enormous work you focus on. What speaks to you with a special power, with a special poetry? And that's going to be different from one condition to another. For Baran, for Sweezy, and Magdoff, one of the most overwhelming realities was the Soviet Union and the communist parties around the world that looked to the Soviet Union, mostly supporting it, in the Trotskyite wing critical of it, but they were caught up in all that that meant in those debates, in the Trotskyite versus Stalinist, if you think like that, debates of their time. And so the way they looked at some of these questions was to focus on aspects we don't, and we looked at things that focused on aspects they didn't. I think that's the best way to understand the differences that came. So one big one was the role of multinational corporations. Now, for Marx, this really wasn't a major phenomena. You know, Lenin had earlier said of Marx that Marx didn't live quite in the age of extreme colonialism that produced two world wars. And Lenin lived through one of them and knew what cataclysmic transformations it produced, including the birth of the Soviet Union. So for them, for Lenin, he took Marx in a direction to make more sense of finance and the role of finance in colonial conflict. That's why an otherwise obscure Marxist thinker like Rudolf Hilferding from Vienna, whose work on finance took Marx into an area he hadn't spent that much time on. Okay, we don't do it. We look at multinational corporations. Sweezy and Magdorf, in the last years of their productive life, were very, very interested. As a young person, the first task I was ever given working with the Monthly Review was to write an article on the internationalization of banking. And I wrote it, I published it in the Monthly Review because that was a task they wanted then to see done. And I was a graduate student at Yale. Nobody at Yale, they would have, half my professors would have had a hard time spelling Marx's name. They could not give me guidance. They could nothing. The few who knew a little bit ran away from it for fear of what it might do to their careers. But I was eager to learn, so I went, and that's what they told me. So once you start looking at international corporations, and then you begin to see the interaction, the interdependence between the financial and the industrial, and then you begin to see the emphasis on the purchasing department inside these mega corporations and the long, what we now call supply chains, and the enormous vulnerability that this brings into capitalism. They lived, Sweezy Magda, they lived at a time when the core of capitalism, for example, here in the United States, the automobile industry gathered in Detroit, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, and so on, were surrounded in Indiana, Illinois, and so on, and Michigan, by all the feeder companies that provided them with their inputs. They didn't worry about bringing them 10,000 miles from India or China or Brazil. That's all a different thing. And you become sensitized to that if you're an economist. And so you approach the Marx shaped by the rest of the economy as much as vice versa. And I think that explains how people in my generation became very interested in Volume 2's circuits. And then the last thing, Marx in there has a few sentences that were like thunder for Resnick and me. He talks about how other economists don't see the interdependence of exchange and production. the way these circuits bring to the fore. They just don't see it. So some of them don't see production at all. That's my professor. That's my professor at Yale while I'm figuring this out. My professor says production is a black box. It's of no interest to us as economists. That's a technical issue. Engineers work on that. Everything is about exchange. The employer buys inputs and sells output. We don't have to be interested. For a young man who's enthralled by the idea of exploitation, I now have to come to terms with a teacher who has magically made production no longer relevant. It's not that it isn't the center, it disappears altogether. There is no surplus, there is no exploitation. Or if there is an exploitation, it's because an employer mistreats a worker in some way or other, which, nothing to do with what Marx is doing. Marx takes the abuse of workers as a given because he sees it everywhere. He doesn't need to have it pointed out. Nobody did. He's trying to figure out, why is that happening? And that's what his analysis does. Whereas the modern thinker has to make it go away. He's so distressed by the very idea that it could be going on that he has to expunge Marx from the curriculum and production from the analytic. It's really remarkable. And then Marx says, the classical economists were better. They at least went from one situation of production to the next. They didn't understand the interspersal of the exchange relationships. So they had a different kind of mistake. And as Marx works that out, right there in the early parts of Volume 2, you have a eureka moment, both Resnick and I did, when you realize this is a condensed explanation of the difference between classical political economy, production to production, and modern neoclassical economics, market to market, and doesn't understand neither the exploitation nor the role of production and its interaction with exchange. It is, in fact, a condensed history of economic thought. And by the way, that stated interest of Steve and me. So the last book that we wrote together was the Contested Terrain, Contesting Economic Theories, Marxian, Neoclassical, Keynesian, was an attempt to flesh out what Marx had taught us in Volume 2.
Wow, that's very, very useful, Rick. Thank you. I want to turn now in the remainder of the time. We have about 17 minutes in this episode to part 2 of Volume 2 of Capital, the turnover of capital. And he's devoted, believe it or not, 10 chapters to that particular question. So clearly, when I first read this, I was like, this must be important. And then he differentiates between the various kinds of turnover rates, the fixed and the circulating capital and the fluid, and there's a lot of stuff here. But let's start with the basics. How do you, when you taught this stuff to students, how do you develop the motivation, or how do you kind of teach this stuff? What is the turnover rate? Why is it important? Why is he spending so much time discussing this concept?
Okay, he's spending a lot of time because at his moment of history, there was a very widespread tendency to think that the profitability that capitalists were always looking for had to do with the conditions of exchange. It was part of the effort not to see the production system as exploitation. It's been an idée fixe of the neoclassical tradition for over 150 years, and we should be respectful. 1870s is when this breakthrough happens for them, They can forget the labor theory of value. They can substitute a utility theory of value. The utility is gained when you exchange something you like less for something you like more. And in that more is a sublimated version of what exploitation's more is all about. And you get away from production. So Marx is trying to tell them, no, what you're watching in exchange is not about where profit comes from. Profit comes from somewhere else. What you're watching is the entirely different question: how does profit get redistributed among capitalists after they have ripped it away from the men and women who produced it? So that's the large goal. Now let me do the economics, because they really are very simple. Here's the problem Marx confronts. Imagine two capitalists who are aware of each other, so they are competing. Each one is trying to maximize their profits for all the reasons that Marx and others understand profit maximization to be a crucial part of competition. But one of them is engaged in a production process that takes 1 year. The other one is in a production process that takes 2 years. By years, I mean the moment from the minute you buy the first inputs to the moment you receive money for selling the output. The whole circuit, M, C, P, C, M, as we've done it. Okay, Marx right away notices what everybody else notices. The first capitalist says, my rate of profit is 10%. The second capitalist says, well, that's mine too. It's 10%. No, says the first one. I get my 10% at the end of 12 months. You have to wait until 24. Therefore, at the end of 24, I will have two whole circuits, each one delivering me 10%. So I'm going to have, if nothing else changes, 20% to show at the end of 2 months. You are only going to have 10% to show. And so let me tell you what you probably already know. No one in their right mind is going to invest in what you do, because that's not a way to survive competitively. I will have twice as much money, assuming we start with the same amount. I will have twice as much money to invest in my business at the end of 2 years as you will. And nobody's going to do what you do. And in fact, I'm going to predict you're going to be out of business, because no one is going to give you credit. That you're impossible. Now Marx points out, suppose, however, that there's a demand for what the second capitalist, the one who takes 24 months, suppose there's a demand in the economy for what that one produces, whatever it is. Now that demand could be satisfied if they had enough capitalists to produce and to take it to 2 years and have the output and sell it and realize their 10%. But no one's going to do that. So that demand will go unsatisfied. Or to say it in simple English, the supply of that second commodity that takes 2 months will not be sufficient to meet the demand. Now, what happens when that occurs? Answer: the price goes up. So whatever the value is of that second commodity, it will not be selling at its value. It will be selling at a price above value, and that price will continue to go up until it induces a supply by the rising price, that meets that demand. And so Marx says what you're watching is a process of equilibration among supplies and demands, so that a demand is satisfied by what competition imposes on capitalism, namely equalization of a profit rate. Capital goes where the profit is highest. And in the story we just told, capital will move to that second commodity because its price is going up relative to its value. And that improves its profitability. Other things equal, that will diminish the flow of capital into the first one. You'll have a capital equilibration, and you will have imagined somehow that the second one is as profitable. And you'll show me, because you haven't read your Marx, you'll show me that in that second one, as the profit went up because the price did, there was no more labor going on. It just had a higher price. And you're going to say, see, that disproves the labor theory of value. The price and the labor are not moving in the same way. No, says Marx, what you're observing is what I explained. You're observing that a disequilibrium between supply and demand under the rule of profit maximization. Under that rule, you're going to get, here we go, systematic inequalities between demand and supply, and the market will not tolerate that. The market, unless you, of course, intervene with market controls, that's another conversation. But if you assume the normal market of a capitalist system, then those market changes effectively distribute the surplus gotten from one capitalist to another. And by the way, for some of you who know this material, you'll notice that later in volume 3, Marx does the same thing to take account of when one industry has a great deal more capital per worker than another one. How do you manage that? And the answer is, again, the capital moves to equilibrate the profit rate everywhere, and by doing so, changes the price value relation so that profits are equalized, and you no longer have a direct relationship between the labor in something and the price that it fetches in the market. But that's not because labor isn't the key element in this story. It's because you don't have in your analysis the role of exploitation, the role of the surplus, and how to connect the achievement of a surplus in one line of work with the movement of capital to equilibrate profit rates across all lines of work.
Wow, that was very, very useful, Rick. Obviously, in the upcoming episode, in the next episode, we'll turn to volume 3 and thereafter to the theories of surplus value, which will bring our discussion of capital, this magnum opus, a 6-volume set. In our world, some people think there's only one volume. We like to believe that this project consisting of 6 volumes. We'll return to that particular problem with Professor Rick Wolff. Guys, bourgeois economists will tell you that the relationship between the employer and the employee is no different from any other market relationship or relationship of circulation. A buyer interacts with a seller. Yet, I want to turn you to page 115 of volume 2, where Marx says, the capital relation arises only in the production process because it exists implicitly in the act of circulation, in the different economic conditions in which the worker and the employer, the buyer and the seller confront one another in their class relationship. It is not the nature of money that gives rise to this relation. Rather, it is the existence of this relation in the real world that can transform a mere function of money into a function of capital. All right, guys, I hope you got something out of it. I'll see you all in the next episode. Take care.